Are you an ambitious, driven entrepreneur starting to feel overwhelmed, maybe a little trapped by your business? Well, I have a solution for you. It is the 5-day Bottleneck to Breakthrough Challenge, where in an hour a day, we will give you the roadmap, the blueprint, the treasure map to where you can find yourself with more free time, more freedom of money, and a more valuable business. Hope to see you soon. www.bottlenecktobreakthrough.com.
Hello and welcome to The Real Bottom Line. Today we're going to talk to the founder of Dovetail Summit and also Two Roads Team Building, Alexis. I'm so excited to have you here today because you're kind of like a multi-entrepreneur and you work with your husband. So you're touching on a lot of the things I really love to discuss in the podcast. So hello and welcome.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here. And it is so nice that we're actually both speaking from the same province finally.
Woohoo, woohoo. That's right. Okay, so I love to start these conversations with kind of like, how did you end up here? Like, did you ever work corporate? Did you have quote unquote a real job before you became an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's been a long and winding road. I've had a lot of different jobs. Started off my entrepreneurial career as a young babysitter and a fan of the Babysitters Club. I don't know if any of your listeners ever read those books, but I thought I would start that up in my neighborhood. So I literally went around with my hand-drawn personal business cards to all the neighbors and started up a little babysitting empire with some other girls. And eventually found myself always having a side hustle, always a side gig through high school and then in university, and everything from like different bracelets to flipping handbags to all manner of different things. But I did kind of go the traditional route. So like many listeners, I went to university and then kind of thought, all right, well, what's my skill set and what's my undergrad and what should I go back into for a postgrad? And so I ended up going back to school to get a B.Ed and becoming a teacher. And so I don't know if you knew that, my background's in education and in teaching, and my career kind of evolved from there. So long story short, yeah, I started as a teacher and realized quite quickly that that was not destined to be my career forever, but it was a really beautiful way to start my career as an adult, and got to travel and worked for international schools. And yeah, and so didn't go from teaching right into entrepreneurship, though. I went from teaching into consulting as a teacher trainer, doing corporate training, teacher training, working all over the world. And then the consulting sort of evolved its way into entrepreneurship and the eventual launch of the Two Roads team building company that we still own today.
That's amazing. I kind of want to take a little side journey for a second. Do you think that we're taught in university to go into corporate? Like, is there anything like, are we just kind of programmed all along? Because I feel like it takes some of us a few years in the real world, like out there, before we realize, hey, I think I want to do this on my own as opposed to work for someone else.
Oh my goodness. Yes, 1,000,000%. I mean, I could rant all day about our education system, and having worked in private schools and public schools in North America and then also overseas, I learned a lot about what's working and not working in education. And I think though, like for some of us, the self-belief is such an enormous part, this, and every entrepreneur knows this, that it's such a mental game. And so for me, I needed to go and work for another. I eventually worked for a startup. I was a consultant, but I was working for a startup and watching this founder, who was not the best leader I ever worked for, but watching what he was doing just helped me recognize, like, I'm just as capable. I could totally go and do this. I could do it in my own way. I could do it in a way where I get to work with the people I want to work with and live where I want to live, and empower myself and the team that I want to work with every day versus working for this organization. So I think, yes, the school system does sort of train us to like go to school. I at the time when I was in my undergrad, I like started studying for the LSAT, and I thought, maybe I'll go into law. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe consulting. And I took like every undergrad course under the sun. I was like a mixed major up until my last year when I finally had to declare. But it was all kind of with that eye on, what grad school am I going to go to? What sort of
Mm.
corporate or like traditional career will I land in? I just had no idea that, outside of law or medicine or teaching or any of the traditional careers that my family members have, that there was something else that I could do.
That's interesting. I don't know about you, but I almost position all the jobs I had before I became self-employed and an entrepreneur. They were lessons in a different way because I got to see, like you said, that leader that may not have been the best leader. And you're like, okay, I don't ever want to do this or this, you know? And I feel like that's informed me a lot in terms of how I'm trying to build my company is some of the things I don't want to do.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, as long as you can have that experience and learn from it and take away from it, and that it can
Mm,
still be, I don't know why this is popping into my mind, but like a loving experience, because it's not necessarily about like working with someone and hating what they're doing and hating everything about it. It was,
no.
I love this component of his leadership. I don't love this as much. He's
Yes.
strong in this area. This is an area that I'm strong in. And like these are the
Mm,
systems and the operations that we're, practicing here. This is what I can take away from it and how I would change it. So,
yeah.
sometimes those experiences can be so informative and just teach us what we really do want most in the world and what we're really capable of. Because once you see behind the curtain in different businesses, I mean, I feel like I was so empowered once I really saw, and working in consulting as
Yeah.
well, like I had seen behind the curtain in a number of different businesses. And it was like such an eye opener to everything is not quite as it seems. Everything is not perfect the way we think it might be. And once you get in there and realize, like, I'm just as capable as these people and I can do this thing, and I don't have to wait for someone to give me permission or give me the authority within their organization to be able to
Mm.
go ahead and move forward.
Well, it's interesting to me. I think this is a good segue actually, because there were some events in your life that kind of precipitated you going into and starting the two companies that you have founded. Why don't you tell us that story and how it has made you into the leader you are today?
Yeah. So the first one, Two Roads Team Building and Training, we've been around for 11 years now, and that I started by myself, but now my husband has stepped into it, and he's our director of team building and managing our little team there. And that business really just started because, I mean, I hate to say I fell into it, but I'd been doing a bit of contract work for a competing organization. And then I took a contract because when I was doing consulting and facilitation and training, it was mostly contract based all over the world, in Canada and the States, and then overseas in Asia and Europe. And so I took a contract. I was working overseas, and my mom called me in the middle of the night one night and said, "It's time to come home. Your dad's going to die." And my dad had been sick, so we expected, that would be happening at some point. But I had the blessing of being able to come home and be with my family for a few weeks and be with my dad before he passed.
Hmm.
Um, and then spending that time in Toronto with my family, being closer to my family when I hadn't really lived near them in a long time, was just kind of
Yeah.
the wake up call that I think I needed at that moment. And so
Mm.
I finished out one last contract and then moved back to Ontario. And I'd been doing some work with different banks and larger organizations. And so I actually got a call from someone from BMO who said, "Would you come in and lead this workshop?" And I said, "Well, actually, like I'm no longer on contract." And didn't have a non-compete, which is a great lesson for all of us entrepreneurs. I know non-competes are there's some legal challenges around them now, but back
Yeah,
then
yeah.
they really could have saved themselves a lot of business if I'd been under a non-compete, but I wasn't. And so I went ahead and took that first contract, and then that led into more opportunities. And then organizations wanted team building to go along with their training programs and their workshops. And so I just grew a team to take that on rather than sending all the business out of house. And that was that evolution. And then Dovetail came from that. So I got 4 years into growing that business. And I've been kind of looking for my people, like as a
Mm.
growing founder, as somebody who came from education and didn't really have a lot of business background. Like I just had no sense for the books and, a
Mm.
lot of like the business side of things. That's the one thing in my undergrad that I didn't really study business. And so the one thing I really should have, instead of taking like random bio courses, anthropology, that wasn't really helping the business. Um, and so I just wanted, but I learned best from other people and from hearing their stories, as many of us
Mm.
do. And I just wanted to go away for a weekend. I thought it'd just be one weekend and I'd make some friends and then, we'd be able to hang out. But I thought I'd go away for a weekend and I'd meet some other women in business. I'd hear their stories. I'd get to, share my experiences in business. And at the time we were doing a lot of work with tech companies. So I was experiencing a lot of bro
Mm,
culture and like some of the leadership challenges,
mm.
being a woman at the front of the room in those environments. And that's when Dovetail started. I put word out. I had a couple people that I knew, but I really didn't know that many people in entrepreneurship in the Toronto area, like women. And I did a bit of stalking and I reached out and I said, I'm going to plan this weekend. I'd love to have like a dozen women. We're going to go up to Cottage Country north of Toronto. Would you be interested? And some people said, no, I get paid to go to things like that. And I said, but it's not that
Mhm.
kind of thing. It's, it's not
Right.
a conference. It's like a more of just a small, intimate retreat. And other people were really interested. And that's they invited friends and I had all these phone calls and curated an amazing group. And we had 50 at the first one. And that was 6 years
My
ago. And
goodness.
that was the beginning of Dovetail.
Mm. So did you see that there was a gap for the women leaders of thriving entrepreneurial endeavors that you thought was missing and that's what was needed?
Yeah. I mean, I think for all of us in business, like there are now that I'm, been in this industry and running the other business and kind of been an entrepreneur for a lot longer. Now I know there are other options, there are other groups. There are things like EO and
Yes.
YPO and WPO. That a number of our ladies who are now in Dovetail are also in some of those other groups. But at the time, yeah, I knew that I couldn't be the only one. And as I reached out to people, I really realized that I wasn't the only one who was looking for more than the typical conference environment,
Mm.
and less of the mask wearing, I guess you could put it, as like that when you
Um,
go to a conference where you go to an environment where there's just kind of this more corporate feeling. You're in a boardroom, you're sitting in an audience, and you're watching someone on the stage, and you're swapping business cards, and it's just this very
yeah.
transactional sort of, you've got to kind of keep your guard up because you're kind of like, you might have clients in the room and you kind of have to show up a
Yeah.
certain way. I knew that there was a desire to get past that and just to be able to let down your hair and put your feet up and just have a real conversation without
Mm.
cameras, without PowerPoints, without it being, one person on the stage and everybody else is just sat there taking notes and trying to learn from them or the dreaded thing for me was the lining up to be able to have a conversation with someone who's on a stage,
Yes.
which I just hate that feeling. And as somebody
Yeah.
who speaks now, I don't love it either. Like I would much rather than have a lineup of people who want to chat, have like a circle of chairs and have a conversation because I bet that, every person who's lining up, whether I was the one lining up to speak to someone or whether people are speaking to me, I bet that so many people would learn from what, people are sharing in that conversation and to be able to have more of a dynamic environment versus that sort of transactional or one focused audience versus
Mm.
speaker environment. And so, yeah, that was the need for me and the need that I know so many others have is just to take down that mask, like get behind the curtain with each other and be really honest and vulnerable and real and to be able to share all of it from the business side of things to the personal side of things because they're all intertwined. And
Mm.
yeah, and to learn from the incredible wisdom of the woman in our room because it's never about one woman at
Yeah.
the front of the room. It's so much about just what everybody can share and the questions we ask each other and yeah, just the way they show up to support.
I love that. I feel as a culture that there's certain cultures that revere age and wisdom, and I'm not sure that we're there. So I feel like by giving people a platform like that, we
Yeah.
can tap into that. There's, how we do things might be new, but really there's not a lot new.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That brings me to the point. The other thing that I've learned from watching some of these other groups is that once people, I refer to it as graduation, once they graduate from their business, so they're no longer in the CEO role or they're no longer in the C-suite, or maybe they've sold the company or they just stepped out of that day to day. They have so much wisdom to share and they are by no means interested in, golfing every day. Like that's a
Yeah.
boring life. And yet they're cut out of these other groups because they're not involved necessarily day to day in the way that they still were. But they're still looking for opportunities to join boards, to invest in others, to mentor, to learn from those, my favorite thing is to see a 76-year-old and a 26-year-old sitting by the fire, just sharing with each other. And it's not just one directional. It's not just the 76-year-old sharing her
No.
wisdom. It's the 26-year-old saying, well, this is what's happening in our market right now. And this is what we're learning. And this is what we've been trying. And, that kind of connection and conversation, there's so much to be said for it. And so, yeah, to build a culture where we can really learn from each other, regardless of what industry and what age and, even
Mm,
what level of experience to a certain extent, because there's so
yeah.
much to be learned from people who just, made their first 7 figures to those who've been in it a lot longer. Sure, they
Yeah.
might be generating higher revenue, but they're like, what's happening in this dynamic industry, in this space that you're in your business, and what can I learn from that? So yes, I am here for all of that peer-to-peer
Oh,
wisdom.
I love that. Now, question for you. How has the challenge been? Like, so I know that you have some really interesting tips on how to grow a thriving community, because I feel like a lot of us entrepreneurs have an opportunity to build community. And because being an entrepreneur can sometimes be a lonely gig. And, you actually actively went out and tried to solve that problem for yourself and in the and in the and ended up starting a business out of it. And so, what are some of the things that you think are important about a community to set up?
Oh my goodness. Yes. Well, I guess depends on whether or not people are just trying to grow community in and around their business, or whether they're looking in their region to start a
Mm,
community of entrepreneurs.
right.
There's a couple different things there. When I speak to people who are, I speak to women entrepreneurs just about every single day. And, sometimes there are referrals or new intros. And so I speak to women out of my region, out of Canada. And sometimes they are looking for that close connected circle locally. So they're like, well, yes, I'd love to come to Dovetail and be part of more of a global circle of women, but how do I start something near me? Or how do I, even
Mm,
like a monthly entrepreneur dinner or a quarterly entrepreneur dinner,
yeah.
something like that. So that would be a different thing than building it in and around the business. But for those who are interested in doing something locally, I mean, I think it's so much of it is just having the nerve to put yourself out there and reach out to strangers and say, I'd love to host a dinner once a quarter just to start. I've got, if you can start with one and say, right now it's just me and you, but if it's you
Yeah.
and I, then I'm sure we can find 3 more, but just starting really, really small. And putting those dinners together can be such an incredible thing. And that's actually, I started that years before I started Dovetail. I was just doing dinners and trying to pull groups of women together and keeping it really, really small. And that was the indication that this wasn't just something that was needed, but it was something that I loved doing. And then on the company side,
Mm,
oh my gosh, the stories around, like, I think sometimes people are like, well, that doesn't apply in my industry. I get building community. For example, friends of mine have a fitness studio in Toronto, and they've done an incredible job of building this in like just such a powerful community around it. They are constantly sold out. You can't get into the classes, which is actually a
right.
problem. So now they have to open another studio, which is a great problem to have as a business owner, in a very competitive market where there's a gym on every corner. And they've done that through building a really, really strong community. But people in other industries are like, well, I have a product-based business. How am I supposed to build a community around that? Like,
Yeah.
really, it's more like an audience kind of thing. But there are so many great examples of people who have successfully built community. Another one is a friend of mine who has a shoe company. And you wouldn't think shoe company community, like how does,
Mm,
because like usually it's shoe company might have an audience of people watching their social media, but
right.
she and her team really built community. And it's they have children's shoes and they have women's shoes, and they built a community of moms who were
Mm,
supporting each other, because that's the key to community, is that it's not just
yeah.
one directional, it's not an audience, it's an interconnected dynamic community. And so this community of mothers that are huge, like super fans of the shoes. They love the shoes, but more than anything, they love what the brand stands for. And so
Mhm.
they connect, they have a Facebook group, they support each other with like mom advice and like, oh, if you love these shoes, you're going to love, these diapers, these clothes, whatever it may be,
Yeah, yeah.
for moms. And so her community, she had this massive situation that came up during COVID with their suppliers. And people had ordered shoes, and the shoes were stuck in the supply chain, and they couldn't deliver on them. And it was going to be like 6 to 8 months. And
Oh
in the
my goodness.
meantime, they couldn't stop selling. And so, in order to like release these shoes and continue growing the business and continue even just serving their audience, they had to continue to sell. And so, these people in their community loved the product so much, loved the brand so much, loved each other because they were all rallying behind the founder, that the people in the community started buying, even though they knew they weren't going to get those shoes at that point for like more than 6 months. Then it was like 8 months, but they were essentially just rallying behind because they had that deep connection to each other, to the brand, and to the founder. And so I think there's like a space for growing community, regardless of what your business is or industry is. I think
Yeah.
that it can be so transformative, and just evolve things from being, again, that really transactional dynamic.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Hmm. Um, the pandemic, how did that affect your business? Did you go 100% online for a while? I f- and how do you feel like, do you think there's still space for virtual community building?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but I love Zoom and I hate Zoom. And so it's amazing because you and I have been in different provinces since we first met, and
Yeah.
we've actually gotten to know each other and been able to support each other. And like, that's a beautiful thing. And I know that people are often zoomed out at the end of a workday. So then adding to that with a community gathering, it can be a lot. And so I think, like, as far as community building, online, for sure, there's still such a need for it. I mean, even that example I just gave of the shoe company that has a Facebook group, they could easily have any other platform group, Mighty
Yeah.
Networks or Slack or whatever it is, but I still think people need each other. They need that connection. And there is a desire for that in the entrepreneurial space. I think for us, because we serve a high level of entrepreneur and leader, a lot of our ladies are in meetings all day. And
Yeah.
so we just have to be conscious of how often we're running those online gatherings, the benefit of them, like they have to be very valuable. Otherwise, we're just
Yeah.
not going to see our community come out to them. And then, as we look forward to the next few months, having those in-person gatherings, and then for 2025 as well, the consistent in-person means that the online is just like a continuation of that. So you really build the
Mhm.
community and strengthen the community. And then when you gather online, it's almost like a little bonus to have that reconnection and that touch point, and
Mhm.
continuing to further the relationships and the wisdom sharing and everything else. So yes, I do think there's a need for it. But personally, I really thrive on doing this in a space where we still have in-person connection as well. Because
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't do it if it was only online. Although during COVID, we definitely did have to go full online. And
Yeah.
I was like, I mean, personally, I was like gathering entrepreneurs for like secret walks. We like distance walk from each other, but we would at least be able to like be in person. That kind of
Right.
kept me going. Because yeah, the online only can be challenging. You just don't feel the same. Yeah, the same.
Certainly. Certainly. Um, Now with your company, the two teams building, why is effective team building so important in organizations? And when should leaders be thinking about, like, how big is a team before you do team building? And when do you start? How do you start?
Oh yeah. So Two Roads team building came out of a place of, initially it was just, me running workshops because that was like my background. But then I had customers saying, we want to bring a larger group of people together, and like, should we run this workshop we just did for the executive team? Should we run it with 100 people? Or is it, should we do something else? We haven't gathered this group together before. So I think it really depends on the company and their needs and what some of the gaps are in the moment, but team building can be done at any size business. It doesn't necessarily always look the same. The programming never looks the same. It really depends on what your group needs and the amount of time that you have. And so with Two Roads, we run everything from an hour-long session that's kind of designed to be, rather than doing cocktail hour with your team
Okay.
at the end of a day, at the end of a long meeting, we'll come in and run something that's interactive, or we'll start the day with something interactive to get everyone together, bring the energy into the room, and then end the day with something that's a better alternative than just feeding your team alcohol and crossing your fingers that it doesn't go sideways.
You should throw some
So those
sugar
are,
in for sure.
oh my gosh, yeah. So those are a couple options. And then, yeah, and then otherwise, I mean, we also do custom work. So
Mm.
our core team building, much like other team building companies, they're large scale engagements just to get people connecting with each other, learning about each other. A lot of teams now, because they're running almost full remote or partial remote, they don't have time outside of,
Mm.
strategic meetings where they even know each other, and how can you expect to
Yeah.
have a positive working relationship when you know nothing about your colleagues, there's no personal connection. I mean, retention is so much harder when there is no, like, there's so many statistics about this, but when there's no
Yeah.
personal dynamic, when people just get on Zoom, they have a meeting structure to follow, chop, chop, and then they're done. And there's no, not water cooler talk, but like, there's nothing more. There's no dynamic
It sounds
connection.
very transactional versus
Oh,
relationshipy.
yeah. It's like the bane of my existence, transactional relationships. And so, yeah, I think it is really important, even for small teams, to have something. And it doesn't, if you have a small team, hiring an outside facilitator to run something might not be the wisest spend. But it's still worth doing something that isn't alcohol based, because we're seeing more and more often now, a lot of people are choosing not to drink alcohol. Cocktail hour is not culturally appropriate if you have a diverse team, especially. And it can be a risky move to bring
Yeah.
alcohol into the equation. Like, the number of CEOs that I've talked to that have had, team retreats or meetings that ended in cocktail hour that went sideways, and then they've lost staff, or inappropriate things have happened. It's just best to stay away from any of that.
I like the fire. I like the
Originally.
fire.
Oh gosh, yeah. I just wouldn't, I would avoid that. So yes, I think team building, I think leaders, when you look around at your team, and you're on a Zoom meeting and people haven't met each other in person, and they haven't had any sort of, outside of work, real conversation, and they don't really know each other enough to know how to best communicate with each other, enough to know, what is this person's communication style? What is their leadership style? What do they love? What do they thrive on? And, like, really importantly, the number of times we'll do a team building event and we ask, sometimes it's just simple conversations, simple questions that we ask at a table at a breakfast, for example, to start a day of meetings. We'll give them questions to discuss with a partner, and then they share at their table. People don't have a clue what other people's background and experience is. And they're saying, well, I'm sitting here next to Jim, and I had no idea Jim's last job was my current job. And, I could be going to Jim every second day for the questions that I've been having, but I didn't even know that he was in this role before. So I just think, like, it's so easy to overlook it, and people kind of roll their eyes at the concept of team building, but it is so essential to bring people together and to have something guided. And then I will say just one last thing, to bring an outsider in. Because a lot of the time, especially smaller businesses, CEOs will say, well, I just do it myself, but then you're not engaged in it because you're so busy running it. So having a facilitator come in, a professional, adult, mature facilitator who can manage if things go a little sideways, because sometimes things do, people can get competitive, or people can get, maybe inappropriate topics come up, or there just needs to be some moderation there. And so having somebody come in to guide the team building is it's such a benefit and a worthwhile investment. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, working with your husband, how did that happen? Because I started my business and I was working it for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and then my husband joined in, and it was supposed to be temporary, but he's never left. So how was your journey?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened with us. I started Two Roads Team Building just about 11 years ago now, and was running it and also running Dovetail, and had, a team in both, and kind of had some crossover. So there's a little, things that needed to be ironed out there. And then I met my husband, and his background is really similar. He's a former teacher. He was a summer camp director for 8 years, working with young adults, and then they had corporate groups in the off season. So that was kind of an interesting, when we met, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I do corporate team building, and we bring the groups out to camp, and we do leadership workshops." And I was like, "That sounds really familiar and interesting," and kind of just, at the time, he was really happy in the role that he was in. And as we moved our relationship along, he asked if he could come out and help out at one of our workshops. And in that workshop, he was like, "Hey, do you think I could run this thing right after lunch? Like, this 10-minute little piece that I know is on the schedule. I think I do a really good job." And I just stood back and watched him, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just married someone who is so much better at this element of team building than I am. And he's, a really strong speaker. He's great at, like, dynamic on the fly facilitation, which is so much of what facilitation is about, is that reading the group, reading your participants, understanding how to engage them further in a debrief conversation. or in an interactive experience, and then running with it. And just watching him that first time, I was like, the next time, the opportunity came up, I said, well, do you want to come and co-facilitate for the day? And I'll just get you to run one thing, and then you can watch, the two of us that were facilitating do the rest and see how you like it. And then the next one, it was like, well, do you want to come and co-facilitate? And I'll actually get you to run an hour. And then it was,
You lured him in, Alexis.
yes.
You lured him in.
And then I think he had a little bit of an aha moment. With summer camp directing, it's a really fun career, and some people make a lifetime of it. And others, like his closest friends, actually 3 of his closest best guy friends, all ran summer camps at the same time in their 30s. And he and his friends all kind of hit this point where they were like, is this going to be a lifetime career, or
right,
is it time to move on?
A turning point.
Yeah, that turning point came for him and all of his friends within like the same year. And he decided that it was time to move on. And so he was exploring other options. And I said, well, we've got quite a few programs that you could be running while you're exploring. And that just evolved into him stepping in as director of team building, and then, doing more training and doing more facilitation. And and that's how we landed here.
What's your number one tip for balancing work and life when you work with your partner?
Oh my gosh. I ask couple entrepreneurs this all the time because, what's the advice? And the advice is always like, don't talk about work after a certain time at night. Don't talk about work. If you're laying in bed at night and something pops in your mind, don't mention it. Try to have dinners where you don't talk about work. And everybody kind of says the same thing. And yet the reality is, like, no one that I know is doing this perfectly. Even the people who are like hyper systematic about it, who are like, we follow EOS life, or like, we have the family system and we only do these things. We have, weekly family meeting. Da, 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 da. Even those people, when it comes down to it, like, no one has it perfectly dialed in. So I think the first advice is just don't be too hard on yourselves. Is that don't expect that anybody is nailing this perfectly, because it is a challenge to, this, to run a business with your partner. It's hard. It's hard sometimes it's hard, and sometimes it's so beautiful and so rewarding and so much fun. And just getting to see the best of that person at times, and to witness them in their greatness, and to see them shining is so awesome, because most people with day-to-day jobs don't get to witness their partner, crush it at a
unless
meeting,
they're a professional athlete that you go to their game or something, right? That would be the only time, right?
Yeah, most people aren't like watching their partner just like run a meeting so well, or be on a sales call and have just like the best rapport with their client, or for me, it's like watching him at the front of a room with 500 people, and he's just, it's the first time he's given that talk or he's led that exercise, and I just get to watch him and say, like, oh my gosh, like, what an incredible human I got to marry. So it is a beautiful thing. And I think that's been my biggest lesson, is just to try to find those moments when I get to watch and love on him from afar, and appreciate that while it's really hard at times, there are also so many times when this is such a gift that we get to do this work together. And that we get to travel together, and we get to, now we're like site visiting and stuff together for Dovetail and the other business, because we have clients in the corporate business who are also doing a bit more like executive retreat stuff and travel. So yeah, just looking for those moments to see each other shine is it's pretty awesome. So
on the prep notes that you did for me, Alexis, for today's conversation, you talked about answering the call of our lives and how to tap into whatever it is that the world is calling you to create. What does that mean? And how do we seize onto that?
I think, because again, like, I speak to entrepreneurs every day. I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs who are doing what they feel is a calling. And some of us, I may have fallen into running the Two Roads team building was some sort of something that I just kind of fell upon. I happen to have a good skill set, my background sort of lined up, and, it's a good business and it makes money, and, eventually we'll probably sell it, and that sort of a thing. But I had this nudge 4 years into building that business, and that to me felt more like a calling than just a business. And for me and for others that I've talked to about this, it's this constant sort of back of your mind. You can hear it, you know, it's something that you want to do. Maybe for, like I said, I was hosting a couple dinners and I was kind of dipping my toe in the waters, but like I just constantly felt like that's not it. It's not enough. Like I know I want more than this. I know I want like those, you know, deeper, more connected opportunities. And it did feel like a calling, like something was calling me to like keep going on this even when it was hard. And certainly
Yeah.
over the last 6 years, especially with COVID, there have been times where I'm like, oh my gosh, like this doesn't make logical sense all the time. It's
Mm-hmm.
not making financial sense all the time. You know, we lost a lot of money with COVID because of anybody
Yeah.
running live events. You know, it was a disaster area. There was no insurance for covering for that. But
Yeah.
it just felt like every time I thought about putting it down or closing shop or, you know, just stopping because of the hardships of it, it was more than look at the data, look at the numbers, look at the reality. Like more than
Mm-hmm.
that, it felt like I I can't. And not from an ego place, because I think that sometimes people stay and persist because their ego is saying, well, who will you be without this? Or, you know, that if you quit, everyone will think you're a quitter, or, you know, you won't be good enough in some way. And for me, closing up Dovetail, especially around COVID times, wasn't necessarily about the ego. It was more about what does the world need? What do I need? What do I see when I'm with these women and we're spending that time together? And yeah, and what is this calling? What is it calling for? And so like there's been evolutions over the last few years too. And I think that's part of it, is finding the time, the space to like tap into whatever your belief is. And maybe this is going to sound woo, but whether it's God or your universe or spirit or even just yourself, to find that time to really listen, to quiet down, to shut off the phone and the laptop. And for me, it's always time in nature. And sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
meditation, and sometimes it's hiking or trail running by myself. But to find that time and listen to something deeper than what, you know, what the spreadsheets are saying. And what the business advisors are saying, and what your board is saying, and what your staff are saying, but to listen to
Yeah.
something beyond that. I think there's something like that for everyone.
I love that. What haven't I asked you that I should have, Alexis?
Such a good question. Gosh, I could ramble about building community all day, and I know we kind of touched on it so lightly.
Why
And
don't you
like,
give me a couple more tips on building community?
yeah,
Like, what has made you successful? What has made Dovetail successful?
I mean, the most obvious one is just listening to the women in my community and watching them, learning what's resonating, what's not resonating. And I think the not obvious part of building community, and maybe one more obvious one, and then I'll give you the not so obvious part about building community. But the second, and then I tell this to anybody who is building community, whether it's internally within their organization, they want to evolve their team into a community and have more of a community feeling in and around their business,
Mhm.
or whether they're like me or they want to start, you know, we have a woman in Dovetail who started a community for nurse practitioners,
Right.
or, you know, a community of dentists is another friend of mine that started. And so those people, I say, like the first things are really like dialing in on how you create psychological safety above all else. Google did a project called Project Aristotle. It was a huge research project of teams and what makes them successful. And the number one factor of a successful team was not, you know, good communication and trust. It was psychological safety. So how do we create a space where people can speak up, where they can raise their hand, they can ask questions without ever feeling dumb or feeling
Right.
irrelevant or having any fear around that? And how do we create a space where not only can they ask the questions, but where they can show up as their whole selves and give everything that they have to give to an environment? So those two are like kind of the most obvious ones. And then I think like the third is, it's just the inner work of the person who's leading. Because even if you're like me, like Dovetail is not about me. I'm not a guru, you know, at the front of the room. I'm not a sage on the stage. And even if that's not where you want to be in your community, if you are the founder of it, you are the steward of that community, so much is coming from your heart, from your values, from the people that you are attracting, that you're magnetizing to your community. And so it really starts with self-belonging, with belonging to who you are, with understanding who you are and what you want and what your values are, what you really care about and what you really don't want in community. And I think that, you know, knowing that right off the bat, like I've always curated Dovetail, which means that I have phone calls, we do applications, I make sure that we're able to continue to grow this really psychologically safe environment because I'm curating. And my curation process is completely built on my values. So knowing my personal values and then having those calls, I could identify it right away. When somebody said something that, was contrary to my value set, or when something felt too transactional or whatever, I could pick it up and then ask questions to dive deeper to know whether or not that person was a fit. And I think if you're building intentional community, then it's really important to know yourself really, really well and know what you personally desire before you even start to think about how you're growing it.
This is a kind of a specific question, but I'd love you have a summit coming up soon, an in-person session for the ladies of Dovetail in Maine.
Yeah.
I think there's still spots. Who would be a good fit to come?
Thank you for asking. So I am currently having calls for our main Dovetail Summit. It's a 4-day all-inclusive experience that I curate for 50 women. And these are women who are at the top 5% of entrepreneurship and leadership. So we make space for just about 10 ladies in the corporate world, executives. Typically, those women are entrepreneurs. So they are either the fire starters themselves or they're on the verge of starting inside. An example of that would be, women who've started women's initiatives or have started charitable initiatives internally, or they've started something so they have that entrepreneurial spirit. And then the rest of our ladies are founders, again, top 5%. So they have 7, 8, and 9-figure businesses across industries. We do typically attract a lot of women in male-dominated industries. And so there's kind of that nice fit, that understanding from each other of our experiences. And I would say the other thing is we're not hyper adventurous, but we do attract women with a spirit of adventure. So we go to lodges. They are high end, it's a beautiful place. So even if you're not outdoorsy, you're still going to have a great time. But there is that sense of women who want to maybe spend a little more time outdoors and have that connection to each other and to wisdom sharing and masterminding and learning, because we do a lot of, our roundtables and peer-to-peer sessions on business and on life topics, but also that little sense of adventure.
That's amazing. So Alexis, how do people get a hold of you?
You can find us at dovetail.community. It's a .community, not a .com. And there's information and an application form there. And that's the place to find us. So www.dovetail, which is just like the carpentry joint, DOVETAIL.community.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alexis. And I think the real bottom line today is sometimes you have to look past the numbers to know what is the next move for yourself. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.